Hello, I'm Marilyn Sigmund. I'm Alaska Sea Grants Marine Educator, and I'm an instructor in the Teaching About Alaska Seas and Watersheds course. That's a credit course for teacher professional development course at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So the focus of this webinar, which is part of the course, is to provide some science background for teachers about Alaska salmon ecology and both salmon watershed connections and watershed people connections. The salmon life cycle and these watershed interconnections are the primary focus of Unit 3, which is in, you want to go to the next slide, please. Unit 3 in the Alaska Seas and Watersheds curriculum, which is online. It's really for the 3 to 5 grade band, and I know some teachers teach it at grade 4 and even at grade 5. And so there's also the opportunities to teach these same concepts and use some of this content in other grades, other parts of the curriculum. And Beth Trowbridge, who's another course instructor, is going to talk about that at the very end of this webinar. We have 2 presenters today. One is a fisheries educator, Laurel Devaney. She's going to review the science behind the salmon watershed interconnections. And Sue Mauger, who is a fisheries researcher, will be reporting on her recent research, which is on the effects of climate change on salmon stream habitat. We do want to encourage teachers to consider engaging your students in water quality sampling. We don't have the protocols in our curriculum, but at the very end of this webinar, we're going to point you to some places where you can find those protocols. But it's a really good stewardship activity. It's a good way to engage them in monitoring, environmental monitoring, and in middle school, you can collect enough data that they can have some experience analyzing that data and possibly applying it to some local environmental problems. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Laurel Devaney.
Hi there, my name is Laurel Devaney. I was the fisheries educator and education coordinator for the Fairbanks field office with the Fish and Wildlife Service in Fairbanks for over 20 years, recently retired. But a lot of what I did when I was teaching was spending lots of time talking about salmon and their habitats. So it's pretty exciting to me to still have the opportunity to do that. So can we switch the slide? So I think it should be pretty clear that Alaska's abundance of salmon really depend on watersheds, and that's what I'll be spending most of my time talking about today. Switch the slide, please. So a quick overview of what is a watershed. I think the clearest definition to me is it's the entire region draining into a river system, or a body of water. So switch the slide. So watersheds can be quite varied. A lot of them, the source is glaciers or snowpack, but all components of the watershed include tributaries, the large mainstem streams, the smaller feeder streams, lakes, wetlands, and then all the way down to the estuaries where rivers and wetlands meet the sea. Switch the slide. So just a quick overview of Alaska's watersheds. Some can be quite small. They're quite varied. Some are a few square miles. Others, like the Cook Inlet watershed, 47,000 square miles. The Yukon River watershed, one of the biggest in the world, is 300,000 square miles. And there's over 15,000 cataloged anadromous streams, and that just means that those are streams that support salmon. And then thousands of miles of waterways and over 1 million lakes. So we've got lots of watersheds and lots of salmon habitat out there. So switch, please. So let's take a closer look at how salmon depend on those watersheds. They depend on them for all of their life functions. And salmon, the reason they have the definition anadromous is that they use the ocean only for feeding and growth to adulthood. So many of these salmon species spend up to 70% of their life in freshwater, somewhere within a watershed. Switch, please. So the reason that we need to preserve all of these enormous watersheds in some cases is that salmon have very different habitat needs through their lives. The place that a salmon will choose to spawn can be quite a distance from where those young fish will rear as fry, and quite a distance from the migration corridors they use to get to and from wintering areas, but then also to and from the ocean. So you need to keep all of those areas healthy in order to keep your salmon populations healthy. Switch, please. So let's take just a really brief overview of the salmon life cycle. All 5 species of the Pacific salmon spawn in fresh water. It really varies on where and what type of water, and we'll talk about that. And then all of the eggs hatch, and the aileron, the very first life stage of the salmon, develop in fresh water. But from there, things can change a little bit. Some of the salmon will rear in freshwater, others will be in estuaries. All of the smolting stage, when the salmon are going through physiological stages to change their bodies to an ocean habitat, occurs in an estuary somewhere. And then all of them spend at least a little bit of time in the ocean. So let's take a closer look at where these fish spawn and then also where those young fish rear. So switch the slide, please. Switch the slide, please. So pink salmon, we'll start with them. They usually spawn close to the sea. Some of them can even spawn in the intertidal area, but some of these fish can actually venture up to 100 miles or so inland on some of the bigger river systems like the Yukon. I think because they are smaller, less robust fish, they prefer lower velocity water. Switch the slide, please. So chum salmon have a huge variety in the areas that they choose to spawn in. Some of them, like the pinks, are spawning very close to the ocean, and others are thousands of miles from the sea. Chum salmon in the Yukon River can travel over 2,000 miles up to the headwaters of the Yukon in British Columbia. And many of these fish have really specific spawning needs. They look for streams with upwellings or springs. And a lot of that probably is to keep fresh water flowing in the wintertime so those eggs don't freeze, and then also keeps plenty of oxygen to the eggs as well. Switch, please. So Coho, again, have quite a distance of area that they use for spawning. They're usually in headwater streams, so they go up into the smaller tributaries of the main stems of the larger rivers, and they tend to be the latest spawning salmon. Here in the interior near Fairbanks, Coho are often spawning in October as ice is developing on the river. Switch, please. So sockeye are associated with lakes. They usually spawn in streams connected to lakes. Either a lake system is upstream or downstream. A few of them will actually spawn in upwelling or spring areas within the lakes themselves. Switch, please. Chinook, again, can spawn all the way from near the ocean to well up into the interior. Some of the Chinook, like the chum salmon, spawn thousands of miles up the Yukon River near the headwaters. But because they're larger, more robust, more powerful fish, they tend to be in larger river main stems where they spawn, and they can tolerate faster, deeper water and larger size gravel for digging their redds or their nests. Switch. So if you look at the freshwater habitat of pink and chum salmon, these guys, as soon as they hatch and as soon as that yolk sac is absorbed by the aileron, those fish head right to the ocean. So the fry in this picture is pretty close to the size of the fish when they head to the estuaries. They're about 2 inches long, just tiny, tiny fish. When they get to the estuaries, pink salmon tend to stay in schools, and they tend to feed on tiny marine zooplankton. Chum salmon tend to spread out. They travel pretty extensively through the North Pacific, and they feed on other types of marine zooplankton. Switch, please. So Coho salmon fry have the longest freshwater residence. Most of them live in streams for 2 years, and some even will live in freshwater for a 3rd year. The young fish in the fry stage, they're really dependent on slow-moving water. And Coho salmon are actually often very closely associated with beaver dams. They like the quiet pools that are formed behind the dams, and they feed on the variety of aquatic insects that are found in those slow-moving waters. And then once they're a year or so old, those salmon tend to start feeding on fish. Next, please. So sockeye salmon, as I mentioned, are very closely associated with lakes. And as soon as the fry hatch, they either move upstream or downstream to the nearest lake. And then most of them live in that lake system for 2 years. In a few cases, they're actually in lakes longer. And they feed on zooplankton. Next, please. Chinook salmon freshwater habitat, because they rear in those larger streams with more velocity, they're really dependent on the riparian area. And what I mean by that is that strip of vegetation that's right along the river corridor. It tends to slow the water and provides them with pools where they can get out of the current and rest. It provides insects in the form of insects falling out of the trees. And then also it's shelter from predators. So their main food source is drifting insects that are in the water column. They don't forage down in the gravels like some of the other fish. Next. So migration corridors are very important to all the fish, and they're used either for the fry to get to and from summer and wintering areas, because some of the shallow waters that fry live in the summertime will freeze, so they need to get to deeper areas for the winter. And then migration corridors are obviously how the fish are getting to and from the ocean. So that's a pretty important part of the watershed that needs to be maintained as well. Next. So the problem with salmon is if you damage any part of a watershed, it's going to have some kind of negative effect on them. So we'll take a few minutes to look at some of the issues that salmon are having with habitat damage in the state. Next, please. So there's all different kinds of threats to the watersheds the salmon are in, the habitats that they use, and some of those can be erosion, which is, causes siltation, loss of riparian areas, channelizing or straightening streams, which takes out some of the pools and other feeding areas that the young fish need. Blocking fish passage is a big issue everywhere. And then loss of water quality or quantity, and that can happen for a variety of reasons. Next, please. So you really can't underscore the importance of riparian habitat, especially to young fish when they're rearing. The undercut banks that you find along the streams with a healthy riparian habitat are shade and shelter. The water's cooler, stays a good temperature for the fish. It provides shelter from predators. And it also, the overhanging vegetation provides insect food. And it's also refuge from fletch, which is pretty important. When we get our big fall rains, if the fish didn't have the refuge provided by the riparian area, they would just be washed out of their habitat. Next, please. But I think one thing that's really important to think about is riparian areas have an importance for way beyond salmon. They're also extremely important to all different kinds of habitats or wildlife. And if you look at those habitats, they tend to have some of the biggest diversity anywhere. More species of plants, of wildlife, insects, birds. We already mentioned the incredible important role they play in bank stability, but also in maintaining water quality, which is quite important. Next. So there's lots of ways that riparian areas can be lost, and almost all of them are directly associated with human activity. So some forestry or mining practices can have some issues. Human use of stream banks, so building any kind of a structure on the stream bank and clearing out that vegetation is going to start causing erosion. It's taking away some of those structures the fish like to use. And then all different kinds of community activities, road building, house building, anything like that. Next. So one of the issues that happens when riparian habitats are damaged is there's a lot of sources for silt and more silt getting into the water. And that can come, again, from road building, from some mining or logging. But then also increasingly we're seeing silt sources are coming from thawing permafrost. The picture down there in the center is an enormous lump that's on the Selawik River that is getting larger all the time. And it's started with warming, thawing permafrost, and what it's doing is it's causing what was once a clear spawning stream to become quite turbid. So it's obviously going to have some big impact on the fish that live there. And this is something that we're seeing more and more commonly. Next, please. So the effects of silt, it's one of the most dangerous things you can do to salmon. It seems so innocent, but it really isn't. And one of the issues is if there's siltation in an area where a salmon spawns, the silt can actually weld the gravels together and either prevent the fish, the small fry, from emerging from the redd or the nest, or actually it suffocates the fish in the nest. So if you do just a little bit of damage to a riparian area in an area where fish are spawning, you have the potential to wipe out an entire run of salmon just by causing siltation in streams. It can be an incredibly dangerous thing. Next, please. I think one of the next really big issues affecting salmon and their habitat is blocking the passage of the fish. And that happens in a couple of ways, and one of the most common is culverts. Culverts that aren't placed properly so that they're perched or above the water, the stream, so that the fish can't move up and downstream. But then also putting in a dam or a culvert or a jetty can also affect the velocity of the water. It can speed it up to the point that a small fish physically can't get upstream. So blocking a fish passage has removed thousands at least of acres of really prime rearing habitat for young fish just by preventing them from being able to get there. Next, please. So other results of damaging the riparian habitat: less woody debris, less shelter for fish, less protection from floods, more siltation with erosion, loss of wetlands for other wildlife, loss of connectivity, allowing the fish to move around. And then also, one thing I didn't mention here is loss of water quality, because the roots of those plants in place do a really nice job of filtering runoff from the land and keeping that water clean and free of most pollutants. Next, please. So what I'm really hoping is that people in Alaska can learn from others' mistakes. If you look at the salmon returns in Washington and Oregon, for example, they're at 3% of historic numbers. That's just phenomenally low. And in a lot of areas, it's dropping. And most of that is from habitat loss. It's from damaging those riparian habitats. It's from blocking fish passage. And losing the salmon not only is an economic blow, but it's a loss of marine nutrients. Those fish, when they're out in the ocean for a year or 2 or 3 years, they're packing on marine nutrients and they're bringing them back to these spawning areas, often thousands of miles from the sea, and releasing them. And those marine nutrients are what make these wetland ecosystems run. Not having them from loss of salmon runs has widespread impacts. Next, please. So here in Alaska, the salmon just have an amazing economic and cultural importance. And if you look at the salmon industry, there are thousands of jobs that are either directly associated with fishing or are supporting the fishing industry. Also, sport fishing brings in millions of dollars to the state. And then I think it's very important, too, to think about the cultural significance of salmon. The native people in the state have been using this important food source for thousands of years. And hopefully, if we keep our salmon healthy, that'll continue well into the future. Next, please. And I wanted to end with just reemphasizing the ecological importance of the salmon, as marine nutrients absolutely are critical to places like here in Fairbanks. We're in a fairly low nutrient area, and we absolutely count on the nutrients brought from fish from the sea. Not only is it nourishing the freshwater food chain, it's feeding a lot of animals, and it's actually keeping that riparian habitat healthy as well. As those nutrients break down, they're nourishing the trees and making things grow. So that's the end of my presentation. Are there any questions? Okay, I don't see hand rise. So am I ready to be muted and we move on, Janet?
Marilyn, go ahead. What do you have to say here, Marilyn?
Well, I was just thinking, Greg Kowalski, who's on, is going to be taking kids to the Stikine River, and I know other Petersburg teachers are going to be involved in that field trip. That's a really silty river. You want to talk a little bit about how salmon do well in rivers, big river, glacial rivers like the Stikine?
Well, I'll admit to knowing less about the salmon populations in Southeast Alaska, but one thing that's pretty important with a silty glacial-fed river is there's a lot of nutrients coming from those rivers just in the form of ground-up rock. So that siltation from the glaciers is natural there, and it's doing a lot to nourish the food chain. It's actually feeding the plants, feeding the insects that in turn feed the salmon. And then also a lot of times those silty streams for some fish can be just a migration corridor. So they're not doing much of their feeding there. The young are more rearing in the smaller tributaries coming off of the Stikine is where those fish are spawning and then also rearing. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Yes, that's me now. Great. Well, my name is Sue Mauger, and I am the science director at InletKeeper, which is a NGO, a nonprofit organization I'm down in Homer, and our interest is in the whole Cook Inlet watershed and the health of that watershed and helping to sustain all the things that live in the Cook Inlet Basin. And I want to talk a little bit about how Alaska is changing and what that might mean for our watersheds and for our salmon. I will be a little bit South Central focused, but we'll try to broaden it for folks who are interested in systems outside of South Central Alaska. But I want to start off, next slide, please. I'm going to go through some of the climate-related changes that we're anticipating or that are already happening in Alaska and how those are, what effect those might have on stream systems, and then talk about what that will actually mean for salmon. Next slide, please. So this is the Cook Inlet Basin, but I think that the patterns that we expect to see in South Central Alaska generally are consistent across the whole state of Alaska. So what I'm going to show you is a series of maps that are based on climate projections that come out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the Scenarios Network for Alaska Planning folks, who have taken a whole bunch of models and come up with some projections of what climate, and in this case I'm going to be talking about temperature, how the temperature is going to change over the next 100 years. And so this is a map of the Cook Inlet Basin, and this is for the decade of 2010 to 2019. So hopefully this is somewhat representative of the scenario that we have now. These are the temperatures that we see here in South Central, and they go from, up in the glacial high parts of this watershed, which include the southern flank of Denali, temperatures that they're glacial and they're above or below freezing for even in July. But then we go on up to temperatures that are in the 50s and 60s pretty regularly for an average temperature in July. But then as we go forward to the next slide, this is a depiction of what the models tell us things will look like in 2050. And what you'll notice first, those darker colors are warmer temperatures, and you'll see that the middle part of, so north of Anchorage in the Mat-Su Basin, that we're seeing much warmer temperatures. And then if we go to the next slide, which is the projections for 2090, we see that we have in the middle there in the sort of Willow area in South Central, that area is seeing temperatures that'll be above about 72 degrees Fahrenheit as an average temperature in July. That's getting to be quite warm. And in fact, a lot of the change that we're going to see is not just in the summertime, but if we go to the next slide, you can take a look at what the projections tell us about what winter temperatures are doing. So this is, again, 2090, and this is the average winter air temperature. And so this is the average of December, January, and February, those 3 months, and what, by the end of the century, they expect our temperatures to look like. And what I think is pretty shocking is that we do actually have parts of the watershed that will be above freezing for that entire 3-month period. And that obviously is going to have some really significant impacts on our whole landscape. But what I'm going to focus on now is talking about how those changes are going to impact our streams. So the next slide. There are sort of 4 major pathways that climate will be impacting our streams that do now influence our streams and therefore have the greatest potential to change in the future. So climate impacts our water temperatures, our water volume, the frequency of our floods and the intensity of those floods, and also some of those nutrient pathways that Laura was talking about, how the terrestrial and freshwater systems interact. These 4 categories will all see some change. Now, I'm going to concentrate mostly on the water temperature and the water volume piece, but if you have questions at the end, I'd be happy to talk about some of the other impacts also. All right, next slide. So a lot of my work has focused on this relationship. I think people have a sense that as our air temperatures have increased in recent years, that we're also seeing some warming in our streams. And so what I want to sort of go through here is just some of the ways that our summer and winter temperatures interact with each other. So here, seeing that the summer temperatures, air temperature increases, and we also typically see an increase in our water temperatures. And the next slide, we also have that same relationship in the winter, that as we see more warmer temperatures, we will actually have systems that are no longer completely ice covered. And we're also importantly going to see a decrease in snow for a lot of regions in Alaska. And as that snow decreases, and we can send the next slide, that'll have an impact on our summer scenario. So with less winter in our hills in the wintertime, that means less water storage on the landscape, and that can affect the water levels in the summertime. So as we have less water volume in the summer, that can increase our water temperatures in the summer, because a little bit of water warms up a lot faster than a lot of water. So we begin to see how some of these impacts can be additive on each other. And then the next slide shows that, so as we have potentially less snowfall, we're likely to see more rainfall, which actually means that we're going to have more water in our rivers during the winter time. And that's something to be thinking about as we think about salmon, because we know now from what Laurel has told us that we have salmon in our rivers all year round. So next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what this all means for salmon, and then I'll talk about some of our specific research that we've done to try to understand these patterns more. So why are we concerned about temperatures warming in salmon streams? Well, salmon, of course, are cold water fish. They thrive in temperatures that are in like the 40s and 50s. And they, once they start to have warmer conditions, they feel a lot more physiological stress, and they tend to have lower growth rates, and they have more, they have to exert more energy to breathe and to metabolize their food. Changes in temperature can affect the timing of when they leave the river, and that may affect when they actually are interacting with the food that they want to eat in the marine system. They also tend to be a lot more vulnerable to pollution, and they can be more susceptible to the toxicity of metals. And so that's something that, as we think about things that are going on in the landscape, we need to keep in mind that with climate change, those impacts could be even greater than they are normally. And then they also have a greater a chance of predation and disease. And we're starting to see that in certain systems. The Yukon, we've seen some ichthyofaunus and more incidents of disease, which doesn't necessarily kill the fish, but it adds more stress to the fish as they go through these warmer conditions. Okay, next slide. And so then we also talked about how the water levels are changing, less water in the summertime and more in the winter. What might that mean? Well, besides the impact that might have on the temperature, Laurel also mentioned the importance of culverts as being a potential impediment to fish moving upstream into their rearing habitat. And if you have lower water levels, some culverts that might normally have been fine to pass fish may suddenly become a barrier to fish. And so low water levels are important to be keeping an eye out when we have those low snowpack years. And then if we have a lot of water in our systems in the wintertime, there's also a chance that those eggs can get scoured out of those redds. So the big rain events in the fall and then increasing rain in the wintertime with less snowpack does make those eggs very vulnerable to being flushed out of the system. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years or so has been related to this relationship and whether if their air temperatures are rising, will all stream temperatures rise? Will they all respond the same way? And surprisingly, we didn't really have a lot of data about 10 years ago to help answer this question. So we decided to dig in and see if we could answer this. And so the next slide shows you where we've been working. So this again is the Cook Inlet Basin. And we started putting out these temperature loggers. You can see them, the little orange quarter-sized logger there is a really wonderful piece of equipment. It's only cost about $100 or so, and you can collect about 5 years worth of data on it. You can set it to log information every minute, every day, whatever interval you like. Oops, looks like we just lost, there we go. And so we put these data loggers out into these 48 streams, and we did select non-glacial streams because these are the streams that we expected to warm fastest. Glacial systems will also be changing, but they're likely to be actually colder in the near future as a lot of that glacial melt increases over the summertime as temperatures increase. So we decided to go with non-glacial systems, and we put these loggers in the streams for 5 years and looked at what the patterns told us. So the next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of some of the information that we learned. So these are the 48 streams, and they're color-coded by their watershed by the maximum temperatures that we saw in these streams. And on the right-hand side, you'll see 3 different temperatures, and these relate to the stage at which a salmon is stressed by once you go above these temperatures. So when temperatures are about 55 degrees or warmer, the rearing salmon begin to show some physiological stress, and again are susceptible to disease and predation increasingly. At 59 degrees, we see streams, those are the ones in orange, and that's when we begin to see the adult salmon being stressed as they are migrating and spawning. And the stop there at the top, the 68 degrees Fahrenheit, is the point at which pretty much every part of their life cycle, these fish are detectably under more stress. And so we ideally like to think of salmon streams as or a healthy salmon stream as systems that are below that 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the 20 degrees Celsius threshold, and anything colder than that is better. And so as you can see, the first thing you notice is that there's a wide range. We've got some streams, in fact, 17 of them in this particular year, 2009. 17 of these streams had temperatures above 20 degrees or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And a number of them were above that 59 and 55 threshold. In fact, all but one of these streams were above those thresholds at some point during the summertime. So that answers that question, do all streams respond the same way? No, they don't. And this information now is really helpful for us to think about where we need to be more concerned about this warming effect than in other systems. Next slide, please. And so this is a graph just to, again, make the point that streams don't all respond the same. And that's great. That means that there will be some systems that are always cold, and those would be depicted in this graph. The blue ones, those are streams that are below that 55°F threshold. And they also don't tend to be very sensitive to changing air temperatures. And these are streams that typically are have really high elevations in their watersheds, so they actually have a very deep snowpack, and it's high enough that it's likely not to be impacted by changing winter temperatures for a long, long time. And they also tend to have a lot of groundwater connections. So there's groundwater that's feeding that stream all summer long, keeping the water levels up and keeping the water temperatures down. But there are also streams, like the ones in red, that are warm already. So these are streams that are already showing some temperatures that are stressful for salmon. And they also are very sensitive to change. So when we have a warm summer, they warm up very quickly. And so those are the streams that, as a fisheries manager, I would really want to know where those are and to be thinking about them as that fishery is being managed, and realize that it has some more stress going on for those fish, and to manage that system accordingly. So the good news is that there is a lot of variability out there, and the other good thing is that we're beginning to understand which streams have the greatest potential to be good long-term cold water refugia for salmon. Okay, next slide. All right, so quick summary. So sensitive non-glacial streams are likely to warm and increase thermal stress to salmon. Insensitive streams, or streams that don't respond quickly to air temperature increases, will remain favorable for salmon and provide good cold water refugia and habitat in the decades ahead. And then glacial systems, as I mentioned, should remain quite cold for the near future, at least until they lose that glacial coverage. And but they also, as they increase all of that extra water in the summertime, they will be adding a lot of turbidity to those systems. In many cases, there are a lot of clear water tributaries that the fish can still use to avoid that, but it is something to think about, that as glaciers change, it's not all about temperature. There will be a turbidity impact in those systems also. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so what can we do? And some of this is similar to the message that Laurel gave us about the importance of keeping our riparian habitat healthy. That streamside vegetation is super important for creating some shade, creating some places where the fish can get out of the warmest of that temperature. And that's also, if they can connect with places that have good groundwater areas, so places where there's springs or seeps bringing in that colder groundwater, that's going to be really important. Wetlands are an important, we think of those as sponges. Well, that sponge is full of all kinds of water that can slowly be released into the stream in the summertime. And as we lose that snowpack, that water availability in the summertime is going to become quite crucial. And so having intact wetlands that can really store that water is going to be important. The culverts, as we lose our water volume in the summer, that some culverts are really going to need to be replaced if they haven't been placed well, and need to be maybe made bigger also. So as we have big flood events in the fall and winter, they need to be big enough to handle those water volumes, but they also need to be placed well enough so that they can provide passage during low flow events. Another thing that we're seeing is some change in our aquatic habitat because of invasive species. And these can really change the dynamics of habitat for fish. So if you have plants coming in that really slow down water volume, you can increase your silt built up, and there can be changes in that habitat that may or may not be positive for the fish rearing in that system. So keeping an eye on the invasive species and trying to limit the movement of certain types of plants from one system to another by a lot of education of boaters and folks wading in those rivers is important. And then finally, we need to do more work to develop local information to help local communities understand how their river is going to change. In Alaska, we still have folks who rely very heavily on a particular river for their food source. And it's important that we help them understand whether they're on a river that's very sensitive or not. And to communicate that information to our policymakers, and of course, to do the good work that we teachers are doing to teach our children about the importance of healthy habitat. Okay, and the last slide. Oh, almost our last slide. A couple thoughts as you think about how to incorporate this information into the work that you do. I think it's great to take kids out and to tell them and teach them about temperature, but I think that it's important also to realize that to create data sets that are useful for real long-term trend analysis, you need to have some really accurate data loggers, and you need to do quite a bit of quality assurance work. So there is totally value in kids learning about data loggers and to take temperatures. But I think that more importantly, it's helping them understand how temperature changes over the day or over a week or over a year, and that there's just value in looking at patterns at that level. And so, for example, if you went out and put a temperature logger in the creek every week with your class, your graph might look like the one on the bottom left. And although there's some value, you can sort of see the beginnings of patterns emerging from that. I think using a data logger might actually give you a deeper sense of how things change over a day or a week or a month. And it might be a fun exercise to use data loggers to help understand those patterns more deeply. On the other hand, there are data sets that are super valuable to have just at one discrete measurement. The graph on the right is the date of the ice movement, or the first day that I think this was for the Tanana and the Yukon River, the one day a year when the ice goes out every year. If you have that one discrete data point every year for 100 years, you actually do have a pretty compelling data set there. So just something to think about, the different ways that you can use temperature and to help tell a story and help kids learn about the new technology that scientists are using. Again, those loggers are only about $100, so very potentially accessible for a lot of folks. Okay, and then the last slide. Just wanted to make the point that although we are talking about salmon and watersheds, ultimately we're really talking about people and Alaskans and our way of life and the way that we identify ourselves. We have a salmon on the Alaska Airlines plane. We talk about salmon all summer long and eat salmon all winter long. And so I think it's just a great vehicle to kind of bring together all the connections that Alaskans have to their landscape. They're a great messenger for lots of things. And I think I'll end there. If anybody has any questions, be happy to answer them.
I got a question, Sue.
Sure.
This is Greg from Southeast Alaska.
Hi, Greg.
Hi. 3 questions. It was fabulous maps that you showed of the increase in temperatures up in Cook Inlet. Is it the same down here in Southeast? Do you know?
I know that the trend is pretty consistent across the state, that we're seeing increasing temperature all year round, but that the wintertime warming is greater than the summertime warming. And in Southeast, you guys are already in that, right on that rain snow barrier all the time. And I think you probably, if you were in a low elevation area, you're going to be pretty consistently in that rain zone. I think the winter temperatures will pop you pretty consistently above that. However, there are places that even if you're down low, if your watersheds are up high enough, you may be able to retain some at higher elevations to help keep those systems with enough water in them in the summertime. I don't know, and I could certainly point you to some resources that would show you how the projections, say for Anchorage or Homer, are similar or different from Petersburg. There's a SNAP, Scenarios Network for Alaska Planning, has some great community charts, and they can show you how the projections, what those look like for your specific community.
Okay. And my second question is the average water temperature in the streams here lower than it is for the streams up there?
That's a big generalization. I would say that, that generally, yes, your systems are probably, your average temperature probably warmer already than they are up here, but not for every system. It really does depend on that groundwater influence. And so depending on the geology of your region, some places have a lot of groundwater that feed those rivers. And some of those rivers will really show very little change in the future because of that groundwater. So I don't quite know the answer to that, but based on, generally, I think we are probably cooler than you guys are down there. And in fact, we're starting to do some of this work in Bristol Bay also, and those streams are also a little bit cooler than they are in Cook Inlet, and a little bit more temperature in some of those streams may actually be more productive for some of those systems. So it will be a varied response for sure.
And my last question is, you mentioned something, you called it a temperature logger. Can you suggest some or that we might use when we go up to Stikine, or something that some of my students can use to take the temperature out of the Stikine?
So what we use are, they're from Onset, ONSET, and they're a temperature data logger, and I could also send you the link for them. The only challenge is, so it's about $120, say, per logger, but you also have to have the software that you intersect with to launch the logger. It's not that expensive, but you would have to have a computer that you would, have set up to do all that. But they're very, very hardy loggers, and they're pretty accurate, and you could, bring them out one day and collect them a week or month later and download all that data. And the other option would be to get something like a max-min temperature thermometer, which you can stick in a system and it'll keep, it won't log the data, but it'll tell you, say if you put it in and left it for a week, when you came back, it would show you how high the temperature got. And how low the temperature got. So it would give you that variation in the system, but that wouldn't be a very expensive piece of equipment at all. The data loggers might be a fun thing, if the kids are old enough to, deal with the computers and the software. It's a neat little tool.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Greg.
Okay, I guess I'll just jump in. My name is Beth Trowbridge. I'm the director at the Center for Alaskan Coastal Studies in Homer, and I've been working with Marilyn Sigmund and the Sea Grant program to do teacher workshops in the Seas and Watersheds curriculum. And what I'd like to do is spend my portion of the time here to show you some examples of some other options and activities that are found in the Seas and Watersheds curriculum for teachers who may not be teaching the 3rd grade or or teaching a different grade level, or just looking for some activities that will enhance your lessons. So these will focus on activities that use some of the information and concepts that you heard about today, and also could be considered ways that you might enhance or elaborate lessons that you already teach. So even at the 3rd grade level. You can see that the Seas and Watersheds curriculum is organized by grade bands, so it's easy to move up and down within these grade bands and to find investigations that fit your education needs. It's also really easy to adapt investigations at any grade level that you want. I wanted to draw your attention to the sidebar in this screenshot. It's in blue, and we'll see all the grade levels that are listed and covered, as well as additional resources that are found on the site. Of particular interest is the instructional strategies up at the top, and here you can find information on leading field trips, on incorporating community resources, and then background on evaluation strategies. So that's a very good tool to know and use on the website. All right, next slide. So we're going to start with the 1st grade unit, Plants and Animals of Seas and Rivers. And this unit asks the questions, what kind of plants and animals live in or near the water? You can begin to guide your students in the process of observing and wandering through investigation 1. And in activity C1, you can actually have your students explore what it's like to be a scientist or a subsistence user of the resource, and have them role play, learning about their environment and the tools that they might use. And while this is technically a 1st grade lesson, this activity can be done at any grade level. You can make it more complex or as simple as you want, and it's a great way even at the older levels to start to explore marine and aquatic careers with your students. You can incorporate the stories that you've heard through this webinar of the scientists that have given their talks earlier, Sue Mauger and Laurel Devaney, and talk about them as examples of scientists that are doing this kind of research and investigation. In investigation 2, plant and animal characteristics, Let's Meet the Invertebrates allows you to lead your students in the investigation of the different groups of aquatic invertebrates that are food for salmon, like Laurel talked about, and allows your students to become plant and animal experts, and includes an activity for doing research on a plant or animal and then investigating life cycles. So there's actually a link to a PDF that shows life cycles of mosquitoes, midges, and frogs, and so you can start to think about life cycles like you were talking about the life cycles of salmon, or learning about the life cycles of salmon. Okay, next slide. Grade 2 explores who lives where and why. So in the first investigation, your students can go out and explore habitats, and if you have a stream nearby, this is a great field trip opportunity and can incorporate a lot of what you learned about today. The We Search, you're probably familiar with this particular way of researching different topics, will allow your students to research a specific animal or a plant that you might find in your habitat and their needs to survive: food, water, shelter, air, all things that you learned about today, and all things that definitely affect salmon and their life cycle. This helps to set the stage for looking at how changes in the environment or interactions with humans might have an impact. So I'm going to I intentionally skipped grade 3 because assuming that a lot of you are teaching grade 3 and that's the focus of this particular unit. And grade 4 has a great field trip activity in investigation 4, our nearby ecosystems, where you can go out and explore the streams and your habitat that you can find nearby. Okay, next slide. All right, in grade 5, you can start to do some investigations that explore the interactions of humans and the ocean. While the focus is on interactions with the ocean environment, many of these activities can be adapted to include freshwater habitats. Fishing for the Future, which is found in the grade 5 unit, is a great game that explores sustainable fisheries and the impacts that advances in technology can have and have had on the resources. And I have done this game with anywhere from kindergarten teachers through middle school teachers, and at every level there's something for the students to learn about what's healthy for the resources, sharing the resources, making decisions about what you can use and what you can't use, how to get along. And then at the higher levels, at the older students really get an idea of how management affects their local resources like salmon fisheries. Also, you'll find a human impact survey in this particular unit, and that is a great way to get your students out and starting to investigate their community and different ways that humans have impacted the different waterways. And it opens their eyes to some of the resources and some of the impacts like Laurel had discussed earlier in the webinar. Next slide. Grade 6, even though it's called Exploring the Ocean, you can actually use this to explore all of your local waterways. Particularly in Investigation 5, Exploring Our Local Waters, you learn a little bit more, your students have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about scientific methods and ways that they can actually investigate their waterways. So they try out various sampling techniques and methods. They analyze the data they collect and start to ask questions about whether or not this data actually is good for learning about the environment or answering the questions that they want to answer. What are some of the tools that are used? What's a good way to collect information? What's not? The pros and cons of the scientific method. And this is where you could easily incorporate a lot of what you heard today with Sue talking about data loggers, or the difference between putting a data logger in or just putting a thermometer in the water, and what kinds of information does that actually give you, and how useful is that? And then they can start to think about actually contributing to citizen monitoring programs that might fit into their community needs. Next slide. Grade 8 has the enduring understandings that explore the very same concepts that were discussed today. Climate patterns cause physical changes in the environment. Physical changes in the environment can change the conditions for life. And science and technology can be used to detect and solve problems. So even though this is a grade 8 unit, it can be explored, I think, all the way down, to 4th grade, 3rd grade, and the different topics. One of the most useful activities in this particular unit have to do with exploring glaciers and the changes that we're seeing with glacial retreats. And let's go to the next slide, because that has. So in investigation 2, the impacts of changing glacier ice, there's a lot of really great resources in this particular lesson. It has students looking at the changes in the physical environment, like the receding glaciers. There's an excellent resource to the right there. You can see images that you can download that have 5 or 6 different Alaskan glaciers where they've taken a photo from years past, like the Muir Glacier here in 1941, and they've compared it to a recent glacier. And so your students can go through and they can look at the changes. They can compare and contrast what's been happening in that environment. There's also a glacier game that you can download and play that talks about just different ways that glaciers are made, and then how they can melt and different effects that they can have. And then the article that's at the top, small fry may be a big problem. That is an article that was printed in 2004 that talked about the glacial silt that was getting into the rivers on the Kenai Peninsula and how that was affecting the salmon fry. So it ties directly into what Laurel was discussing earlier about the impacts of silt and turbidity on salmon. So those are some good resources there. Next slide. Okay, and before we just talk about these other resources, I just wanted to say that I just really encourage you to use the search tool in the sidebar of the Seas and Watersheds curriculum. You can put in any word like watershed and it will pop up all the different lessons and resources that deal with that particular topic. So that's a great way to find ways to enhance your lessons. And this last slide are some other good resources out there that you could use to explore salmon. The Salmon Project has great videos, lots of really great resources, and I encourage you to look at that website. And then the GLOW program, if you're not familiar with that, Global Learning and Observations to Benefit the Environment. It's a citizen science program for students and the public in order to be able to engage in doing some of these citizen monitoring program. So that's a great way to introduce your students to data collecting and providing data to a great big, larger data set. They have excellent protocols that you can follow and very easy to do. And with that, I think the last slide, turn it over to Marilyn again to see if she has anything to add or if there's any questions that anybody has about any of the lessons.
Yeah, just that if you and we'll be getting this webinar out to other people who weren't able to participate, but we'll be watching it. And I've offered to them, although I have forgotten to mention to Laurel and Sue, that if they had questions, oops, here I am. If some people watching it before the end of the semester, which is May 15th, had questions that they could email them to you. That's why I included your emails here. And then after that, since this webinar will live on in an archive on our website, that they could mail if they had questions, but also if they had teaching suggestions and resources related to our units, I'd be happy to get them anytime, even after May 15th, when the course finishes up. So that was the main thing I wanted to do with the wrap up. And thank you, Greg, for being our audience. That was great. And
I've got one really quick thing to add. Greg was asking about temperature loggers. Greg, you might want to look at hobo meters, H-O-B-O. A lot of educators are using those, and you might find that they're at slightly lower price and they might have a more user-friendly software. So if you're looking for long-term monitoring, that might be something to explore.
Yeah, and I just sent you guys links to Onset, which makes the hobo meters, and also the Snap page about the community charts so folks can look at their own community patterns for climate change. And so maybe those are things that could be added as another slide on this or something, if that's possible.
Yeah.
I was just going to add that the GLOBE program uses max-min temperature, max-min thermometers. And so if you wanted to learn about that and experiment with using the max-min temperature loggers, and that's a good way to get started on that particular type of data gathering.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I just gonna say, yeah, I'll make sure to post additional resources where we post the webinar. If I can't figure out how to get it onto another slide, we'll figure that part of it out. So that's great. And I want to thank all the presenters. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thank you very much, all of you.